So it's the world has a little something for everybody right now, unless you want yield, which there isn't. Global interest rates, short rates moved up to 0.9 from 0.6 not too long ago. So if you want something for yield, you have to go into areas that take on a little more risk. But we're in a really wacky environment with something that we have political issues everywhere, with a lot of leadership changes coming globally, particularly in Europe. But you also have the dynamics, geopolitical dynamics between the US and China and a lot of the rest of the world, and US and France now, France and Australia. There's something for everybody on that side too. But I really want to talk about three things. The liquidity that's been put out there in the global system, certainly in the US, and is continuing to be promoted. I want to talk about global debt that is associated with that, and then also the area that I'm most excited about, which is all these great innovations that we talk about on the venture side, like Cintrifuse is doing, because I'm of the belief that we haven't seen the real move in technology changing our lives like we will over the next 10 years. So I think we're in a very exciting time, a very challenging time, and it's a time where we need real leaders. And unfortunately, I think there's a lot of political issues that are not being led by statesmen or stateswomen. And I would say we're losing probably the best leader in the world, in my view, which is Angela Merkel, who's stepping down. I think she's been a very steady influence on the global economy and on the global political situation. And I think that's going to be a big challenge for a lot of the areas, because we have so many things changing going on. But we had a debt problem in 2008 that we solved by taking debt up from around a little over $200 trillion globally to 296 trillion now. So we solved the debt problem by layering on a third more debt to the global system. And that has a problem which will come later on, but is coming now because we're suppressing the rates of the central banks. But the bill comes due, and we're going to have to worry about that. And to fix that, we are going to have productivity improvements that are going to drive the country and the global economy forward, that allows us to manage the debt effectively by growing our having the growth that can offset the rise in rates and interest for us, because a lot of this debt's going to have to be refinanced at higher rates in a later date. So I think there's some real issues that we have, but when you turn around and think about the innovations that you're going to hear from on this tour that we've heard over the last couple of days in Chicago, in Detroit, in Ann Arbor, we have a world that is going to be so amazing. You think about what our kids have gone through. I have 420-somethings, and they grew up in a world that they didn't have an iPhone when they were born, but we're 2 billion iPhones in now. Think about that, from 07 to now, 2 billion iPhones. And we're just going through a transformation digitally that's going to change our lives. In the US, the big element for that, not only in the US but globally, is the productivity improvements that are being reflected through this digital transformation and lower costs. And as we get this right, and we're talking about the ability from to reach so many people with e-commerce and the way we're doing it now, it's changing the way we live, work, and govern. And I think the governing part has to catch up, and I think we're way behind, and I think that's going to be one of the big challenges. Last thing I touch on is the increase of the debate around the $3.5 trillion on top of the $1 trillion infrastructure. I'm not sure where it ends up. I think it'll be a lower number, but we need a lot of that. But we need it without all the political nonsense going on between the two parties. We have to focus on the things we can fix, and enable the country to do what it can do, which is innovate and grow and change for the better. I think we just have to do more of that. We need the leaders that are going to really step up. So I'm going to stop there.
Can I say, so that's kind of a nice macro sort of global look at economic forces, sort of focusing on Cincinnati Zeitgeist. So I got this. This is a question that I'm sort of Cincinnati. These three guys are purely Cincinnati. Does that mean anything for regional, sort of for regional differentiation?
I think one of the issues that it needs for regional is what's going on in China, and what started with the trade wars is continuing this reorientation of global supply chains, and the need for resilience and the need for just-in-time supply chains is got to change, and we're going to have a whole reconnection of the way the global economy works. And I think the Midwest is going to be the beneficiary of it because of all the reasons that you're talking about, lower costs, great skills, and the climate issue is going to push a lot more into the Midwest too. And, you're not, you're going to start a business and build your, manufacturing plants in Florida. They're having trouble with the sea levels there. So I think the Midwest is uniquely positioned for it. I think you need a different marketing program to attract people here. And I think you need to get more groups like this coming through and you'll see a change. But this is a place where you can build stuff and get it distributed in an incredible way. As you said, 100 million people in no time, in one day, is that the number? And when you can do that and you get the manufacturing behind it, you can take that number up and you'll have a real change going on. And I think the Midwest will be the primary beneficiary of that.
And so I don't mean to become the sort of the moderator, but like just I am the plot stirrer sometimes. This is a little bit, it's more of like this is sort of a Cincinnati focused question, and I don't not just specifically for you, but in my experience, having been someone that grew up here but has lived elsewhere for several decades, with a lot of different visitors, I have a positive and a negative about Cincinnati that I'll just throw out there, and then I'll shut up and let the guys really tweet things. So for you, maybe say some good things about this geography. And Jack and I were talking about this earlier. I think that people who don't have a significant amount of time in Cincinnati don't fully understand almost like a local patriotism and the strength of the local culture. And Jack and I were talking, and I have a complaint. I think that really dates back. I think there is a continuous thread to the early part of the 19th century when residents of Cincinnati called this the Queen City and really believed this was going to be the second most important metropolitan area in the country because of the importance of all the river freight and all of the port processing. And this was truly the second most important metropolitan area. And because of perhaps short-sighted political decision making at that time, the opportunity to have a railroad hub here was skipped, and it went to Chicago, which then changed the sort of all these things. But I think there is a continuous cultural thread here back to that time that leads people who grew up in Cincinnati don't think of this as a city that punches far above its weight. I think you go to New York and ask people about what's the profile of Cincinnati. Oh, who knows? Like some small Midwestern city that I fly over, I connect there once and they had chili in New York. Like that's what they know. But I think people in Cincinnati would tell you like, well, we have a P&G and we have West, we have all these, but like people in Cincinnati, they perceive it as punching psychologically far above its weight. And there's sort of a confidence and a gumption about risk-taking and starting businesses that creates the environment here that I think is actually really unique relative to the size of the city. Now, this is, I always disclose when I've had a personal experience. We should never extrapolate our personal experience to mean that that is like a statistically significant sample set. But there's one young entrepreneur whose business really exciting who started here a number of years ago, Live Eyes helped out, who a couple of years ago relocated to the West Coast. And it's like very sad, you see it's sort of like, damn, like that's how the business industry really made it. And he left because they could not find enough young people of the right specific sort of designer skill set that the West Coast is full of, that I think that Cincinnati, I think, has a little bit of a, I would say, like a marketing problem in drawing in 20 to 25-year-olds sort of elite workers. So those are just a couple of things to maybe start some conversation around Cincinnati and Zeitgeist in specific.
So, it's okay.
Yeah, please jump in.
Someone who's moved to Cincinnati, who's lived all over the world, who's moved to Cincinnati relatively recently, 7 years ago, with the intention of moving out of there and probably moving there for return. So the initial idea was living there for 1 year, at most 2 years, and moving back to London. You can sell a house there, and move furniture, or any of that. This city is a city that once you live there and you spend enough time there, you fall in love with it. It's not one of those cities that you hear about and it's like, oh, I want to move to Cincinnati. Absolutely right about that. And it, as you pointed out, the marketing issue aspect of it, maybe the way that news was presented, it is there. Once you're there and you spend a little bit of time there, you fall in love with it. There's no moving away from it. You have lived in Boston, New York, Toronto, all large cities. Moving to Cincinnati was fairly questionable, right? starting investments in Cincinnati, which was hidden before that, so making most investments over here. It was surprising for me to learn that in the Midwest, they had folks from Ohio because of some personal ties in Cleveland, but we ended up picking up Cincinnati because they had 17 Fortune 1000 companies within a 20-mile radius of downtown Cincinnati. Not just P&G, there's 16 others. And that P&G is as much as positive, it's also that pulls Cincinnati down. All the innovation goes to CPG. All the innovation goes at Kroger does the same thing. Now with Cintrifuse making the push for fintech, with programs like Frontier, creating a hub and an environment for us to grow native. We've got a small group of people that like John, Mark, and other gentlemen from Cintrifuse who are really nurturing this segment as well. And that's really helping us grow. And in terms of talent, we've got a crew. My company has, and without saying that our example is something that can be generalized, I can just tell you my experience. We've got people across the globe. We've got people in 3 different continents, especially post-COVID, moving from one place to the next. I think remote work has gained so much more acceptability that you don't have to move to the West Coast, or you don't have to move to New York or Miami because they're a fintech hub or the blockchain hub or a development hub or a design hub. Finding the talent is not difficult. How you get them to move there is then dependent on the company. And as more and more opportunities come up, which there are, and more investors are looking in this space as well, which makes a massive impact, and that helps us grow. We only have one Cincinnati investor as part of our full capital. We're oversubscribed, and that investor is led by Jack and his firm, but it's Queen City Angels, right? So it's great to have them on board, but the reason why we didn't need anyone else over here is because, especially post-COVID, you really get to see it. You were working remotely before that. And all of our investors are from the coast, East Coast and West. It's easily doable. Investors have started to look into the Midwest and have started to find the right opportunities, but you really need to start exploring those assets as well.
But yeah, that part that you mentioned, that the work from home and the changes that are going on there, is actually I think part of the marketing challenge. How do you get the message out of why this is a place to live? And coming from New York, it sort of gets easier by the second. So.
I mean, I'm a paid cheerleader in some respects, but let me just kind of, dignify some of your comments. I mean, can Cincinnati or even the Midwest be a bit provincial and you have a conservative streak? Absolutely, yeah. There are kind of echoes of, I'm trying to resurrect this whole great supply way thing, but yeah, we're kind of haunted by that back there. I think listen, I'm forever chasing that ideal of the startup dancing with the big company, but damn, that's really hard, and P&G is the big gorilla, but it's you've got a thriving startup economy. We have cracked the code on making it really easy for startups to work with big companies, even when the startups really have something, mature and develop. I think it's just, when you're dealing with large enterprises that are kind of built to scale, it's really hard to make that connection. So I think sometimes I'm probably guilty of romancing that, symbiotic relationship. I hope that I get there eventually, but I am finding in fintech that I think there's a willingness that maybe, I do think that's kind of a disrupted sector where I think there's almost an urgency of kind of dancing with the fintechs. I just think, I think a lot of these companies here could be severe risk if they do not undergo their own kind of digital transformation. Maybe P&G has a little bit more insulation on that than some of the banks and insurance companies, but yeah, there's a lot. Listen, I think failure is severely punished. I don't think there's still a lot of, Silicon Valley failure is just like, it's kind of part of the drill here. It's hard when things don't kind of go your way, and I've had that experience myself too. So, so you have to kind of swim against a lot of those currents.
it's good to have organizations like Cintrifuse, and people from, or ex-NGOs who decide to stay out there, at times support us, right? So we as a crew, and I use our example again, we were in stealth mode, then when we got out of it, the only people who knew about us were on the coast. We didn't know anyone in the Cincinnati Shark community, no one in the Cincinnati Shark community knew about us. Lo and behold, I was introduced to John Snyder, the COO for Cintrifuse, and not only did they make it easier for us to get involved in the Cincinnati Shark community, and they introduced us to everyone, and that's what made us realize, oh, Cincinnati's not just a great place to live, but also to grow the startup in, but also open the doors for us for a lot of the larger financial institutions. First Financial is someone who we're speaking with, the CEO, CFO, the top level folks, just purely because of Cintrifuse. The decision makers, where transactions are happening a lot faster because of such organizations. I think getting the word out there, and for folks like you, who, whether you want to grow a business in Cincinnati or invest in Cincinnati, it will be, it's integral for an organization like Cintrifuse to exist, and the services that they provide, I think, are just absolutely valuable.
God, I hope that camera's working. I said that to my boss right now.
I'm a big proponent for Cintrifuse any given point of time. I'm not saying it because we're at the office. I say that all the time. I was introducing someone, John, downstairs as well. And you guys downstairs right now are saying the same thing. It's like, hey, this is how Cintrifuse has worked out for us. Always a big role.
I also think there's a big edge even against other Midwest states because the financial positions of some of those other states are in the position that Ohio's in. And add to that, what Jobs Ohio is creating is really the kind of public-private partnerships that economies need to grow. And when I came out with the advanced tour, we met in June. We all left, all the people going back to New York, that's saying, this is incredible what they have here, nobody knows that. And I think getting the story out, people will come here if we get the messaging right. But we have so many things even against other Midwestern states that I think is a big advantage that has to be part of the story.
The Jobs Ohio one is important because, it's important even for me in my role to kind of toggle between this greater Cincinnati narrative to a state of Ohio narrative. And frankly, the state of Kentucky narrative has probably done more to kind of give momentum to the greater Cincinnati narrative. When I first started this job, I thought it was, Procter & Gamble was going to be the center of the universe in the energy field, but it's actually our airport. I mean, our airport is the undisputed, catalyst of so much fresh thinking about the future of supply chain, future of sustainability, Great Green Supply-Way, and then even biofuels. I mean, I predict our airport is going to be the global leader in the transformation of biofuels, and partly because you've got, Amazon's under massive pressure to figure that out. They just moved the regulatory climate is interesting. That's like a big opportunity. On one hand, people say that's a headache, but the reason why Europe's kicking our butts in green is because the EU really got pretty aggressive on that. And so that's why like a lot of Procter money is in Germany, not locally. But now you've got US regulatory, all these climate commitments just on the biofuels for planes. The target, like 10 days ago, moved from 2050 to 2030 for a 50% target biofuels. I mean, that's going to keep both big companies and startups really, really busy. And so what we need to figure out is like, oh, if this bar has been set, who's going to have this right to compete? And I think the Midwest is in a fantastic position. But we'll need to kind of, think about how you wrap a strategy around it, almost depoliticize some of these issues. A lot of people talk green, you suddenly get these like Democrats. Forget that. This is where the money is going without question. I mean, I always keep thinking if I can just get 10% of what I know Kroger has to spend based on everything they're writing in ESG reports, if I can localize 10% of that spend, I will quadruple my startup economy. And that's the way we need to think. It's sort of like, what do these commitments mean? I'm getting rid of plastics. I have, it's like, okay, who's gonna solve that issue? And just pounce on it.
I hope you're right. We got 250 acres with our company right up next to the airport. So I hope.
Farming it out, right now.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah, right.
To have it, but I would agree too. That this is the Midwest moment that, for the last 30, 40 years, as the supply chain got international, Midwest was really what lost out. All these states and cities just lost their jobs to the international economy. And now that we see what happens with these disruptions, kind of everything's coming back. And you're starting to see some of the moment shine, and particularly, I think being advanced with COVID in a really twisted sort of way, where it's forced companies to allow that remote work where you don't have to be in the dense cities, and you don't have to have all the drawbacks that come with the density, and you can come here and live well, you can send your kids to state schools, and you do all the things that this place has to offer. Maybe it's because I'm a Midwestern guy. I grew up in Milwaukee, I lived in Minneapolis for 15 years, now I'm here in Cincinnati. But I think, being able to compare and contrast among those cities too has been really good. For me in Milwaukee, growing up there, we always just had a chip on our shoulders, the younger, uglier sibling in Chicago. And
We're not just us.
and in Minneapolis, great city, wonderful city, but in many ways it felt like you were 6 hours from anything. And here it feels like you're 6 hours from everything. And so you just really have this kind of wonderful central area, and really just working together to bring opportunities here. We've worked with Ready Cincinnati as we've had opportunities for real estate to fill buildings. And to be able to rely on them to tap resources that we don't know about to help our tenants get bigger and expand. And we've done that. We'll start with a 5,000 square foot tenant, and all of a sudden they grow to be half of a building, and then we fill them up into another building and grow with them. So it's been helpful to see that. And I think locally, as being the outside guy, the part of I think where the city could get better, and where I've seen it is, I think when it comes to bringing opportunities here, the regional area is really good about working together. But I've seen a little bit of tribalism where you're either, if you're south of the river, or if you're north of the river, and if you're north of the river, then you're east side or the west side, or if you're south of the river, you might have this county versus that county. So there's this tribalism that regionally they'll compete with one another. It's like the United States. They fight with one another all the time, but when somebody attacks America, they unite as Americans. It's the same thing here, where if you're fighting, you can fight amongst yourselves, but the moment something happens outside, nope, we'll pull together and we're going to bring everybody.
And it came to a boil with that crazy bridge, right? I mean, now it looks like they're finally going to break through, but that was like the metaphor for regional gridlock, petty gridlock. I think your point about post-COVID, supply chain realities. I mean, supply chains, had to become much more resilient. I think big pressure on localization of supply chains. And I think the green stuff is going to put massive pressure on that. The things that we took for granted, like when I was working at Nestle, shipping Pellegrino water from Italy, I just think that 5 years from now, people are, the kids, our kids are just saying we're doing drugs. Like why? It's like, why would you ever do that? And so you're just going to have a lot of fresh thinking about, locals. It's not like we're going to become provincial, but I do think, the way we build supply chain is going to change.
Great best stuff.
Huge opportunity. Think about like Kroger's like really into 80 acres. Why? They love that model. I mean, they're committed to fresh. That's their big slogan. What is 80 acres all about? Oh, we'll put one of your high-tech pods in the back of your store. We'll literally grow the salads right there, and you will get that immediately. That gives them, much longer shelf space, fresher food. I mean, it's like, so you've got, and that's a classic example of reinventing the supply chain, leveraging technology, harnessing great entrepreneurs, and doing it in the Midwest.
Midwest. That's where you're gonna do it, right?
The FinTech revolution.
There's a strategist out of New York, Nancy Lazar's very well-known economist, rated one of the highest, and she's had a theme for several years. The Midwest is the best emerging market in the world, and I think that's going to bear out over the next couple of years because of the reasons we talked about, supply chains, the China problems, everything. We just have to dial down the political rhetoric and put the focus on being productive and moving forward. That may be a challenge for that.
Well, no, we'd be remiss in talking about Cincinnati Zeitgeist. For anyone who's not from Cincinnati, Oprah, no one less than Oprah says the greatest ice cream in the world is made in the city, and it's available right down the street. So I do encourage you, there are some local culinary treats. And then, Gold Star or Smiling.
You don't know. I do know.
Oh, you do know? Oh, I should never underestimate you.
I prefer the phone to start, so. Yeah, I spend 2 weeks every other summer growing up in Cincinnati.
Oh, fantastic. There we go.
I know they sold this on coming here in August, which I left the beaches of Long Island to come to Cincinnati for 2 weeks, but it was fabulous and people are wonderful. So I would encourage people to learn more about it if you haven't. If you're not from here, you're outside investor. This is a place to start looking.
And I kind of connect that back to some of those food traditions. I connect back to this thing I said about like these long cultural threads relative to anywhere else I've ever been. And when you talk about like the neighborhood tribalism, I remember growing up here, it's like, oh man, like if you're in Anderson, Western Hills is the enemy. There's like this long, like very, very strong cultural traditions in Cincinnati that I don't see other places in the US, which make it an interesting place to do business.
So
A lot of good relationships.
you're absolutely right. So when we moved to Cincinnati, in my family, one thing we figured out was when people ask us, where did you go to school? They're not asking what college you go to school to, they're asking what high school you go to school. So that kind of goes into that whole capitalism, whether you're from the east side or west side, or you're from Forest Hills or Muller or from San X or wherever you want to school. But once you break into that, I think one of the biggest things is once you get a part of that tribe, once you become part of the tribe, the kind of access you have in this city, you cannot have anywhere else. And that's what makes it so unique and so special. Whether that tribe is Cintrifuse or that tribe is the folks with Anderson or that tribe is Cincinnati City Council or the state of Ohio. I don't think the biggest selling point of the Midwest is the fact that it's the cost of living is so low. I disagree with that statement. Other than being house, everything else is more expensive in the Midwest than on the coast. But it's the access. It's the price of that access. It's the ability to have that access, which really changes things. And that's what's so unique.
Hey, I wanted to give my colleague John, who was outside guarding the door, but he talks to Mohsin and hundreds of other entrepreneurs, and I was wondering if you could just weigh in on this conversation. We've been kind of debating both the advantages and some of the disadvantages of Cincinnati as kind of a startup region. Any kind of perspective, and John, like me, actually kind of has kind of California roots, so he's kind of like he stumbled into Cincinnati via the G&G Gillette acquisition, so Boston boy. So,
Kind of California. Yeah. I grew up in the Bay Area in Los Angeles and moved here in 2005 when Gillette's company was acquired. No. Cincinnati. Like G&G and Sept Procter. It's interesting. One of the principal differences I see, and I was telecommuting out to San Francisco once you marketing for an AI startup working on Cintrifuse. Because a lot of the entrepreneurs in the Bay Area start with, what can I build that might be worth $1 billion, right? Kind of back into a business from there. Whereas in Cincinnati, more often what I see is kind of deep domain expertise and passion for a particular problem to solve, which, there's pros and cons to each, but in terms of as an investor, looking for people that are going to be kind of a good steward of an early stage investment and really relentlessly, deeply understand their customer base and are going to build for them. I found there's a lot of really compelling founders in early stage companies in Cincinnati. One of the things we lack, or have lacked, or need more of, is people that run the full cycle, that have played a leadership role in starting, scaling, and exiting the startup, right, which is really invaluable. But we have found either those people moving here, starting to build up a more base of them. Or in some cases, some of the founders are bringing them down and virtually now in a global distributed companies. I think it's a fantastic place to invest in early stage companies, and that's not.
And I handed out to them the top 30 list, or it was like the top 20 list, just to give them a flavor of, the companies that are kind of in the.
Curious if I made it our company.
Yes.
Of course.
Yeah.
I'm interested to see where we sit. You wouldn't have been.
14.
Number 16.
Number 19.
That's funny.
Any comments, or reactions from on any of this?
Questions? What was happening after this? Because I don't know, answering questions, I'm sure we're all happy to take some minutes. Go ahead.
Yeah, so basically, when we talk about New York, whether it's, drivers, there's trades, Silicon Valley, other drivers. Yeah. So far, if you're the major driver here, it's very good information. Support. Yeah, I know. Are there any other drivers which you think distinguish from non-States?
I haven't talked a lot about health or biohealth, partly because I'd say Cintrifuse isn't driving that and supporting it, but there is just a fantastic, like Cleveland, there's just a best-in-class hospital networks. I think UC is really creating a national footprint in health, and I think someone mentioned earlier, Jobs Ohio is just pouring a ton of money into that. And I think there's, we kind of crack the code of things like IP transfer and continue to kind of build that talent base. I think you're going to see, a lot of waves on that front. I think the key thing is to figure out what aspects, obviously health is a very broad category, but where, I think a lot about connected health. I'm such a digital guy. I think that space is just ending COVID kind of, put that on steroids. And so is there an area to kind of play there? But, huge opportunity there. We often talk about future branding in retail, although I think to some extent it kind of is already, it's funny if you talk to someone like Kroger and say, are you a fintech company, or are you a food company, or are you a health company? They'll look at you and they'll say yes. So there's a lot of blurring in these categories.
I think one of the biggest drivers over here is that the corporate sector that requires a CPG innovation, and the health sector, where you see in Cincinnati driving up a lot of the health and non-education targets, the growth within the health sector and the development and innovation in that sector. So I think both of those combined is what's really driving a lot of that. Contact is something which is really emerged out of Cincinnati. Whether you look at Duncan, which started acquired by So, when you look at auction.com with some roots from here as well.
Picasso has roots here.
Picasso has roots here as well. So product is definitely something that's taken on.
So is it so, why so big?
I'm sorry.
If it is so good, why so big? You pair it with 5 big names.
I'm talking about 5 of the top in the industry. We believe in quality and not quantity. It's the biggest thing on that. So for instance, for us, for a group to be based out of, I take it back to my company, for a group to be based out of Cincinnati is out of those 17 Fortune 1000 companies that I talked about earlier. We've got a large number of financial institutions, and we've got a large number of insurance companies that are based there, that are driving that, and having the access to those with the right kind of approach and the right intention that, or them being the right mindset to drive innovation in this sector really helps us out. If we were based in LA, or if we were based in San Fran, or if we were based in New York, We would have an awful real estate clients over there where we wanted to jump on, but not on the institutional side. So if you really wanted to expand, if you really want to grow in the real estate, institutional real estate world, getting some of those big names behind you makes it a lot easier if you have them pretty on. And that kind of access goes back to what I was talking about earlier. That access to that, to those segments really changes.
So are you saying that proportionally more local startups have access to the companies, the local companies, not companies from Silicon Valley or from other regions?
I'm sorry, if
I would say that proportionally more most local startups get adopted by the local corporates than startups from other regions.
so it's not that more local.
It's mixed.
It's not that more local startups get adopted, but if you're a local startup, you definitely have an unfair advantage over global. And if you were using that, if you intend on utilizing any of those Fortune 1000 companies for whatever business sector you're in, they can really prop up that initial growth that you need to achieve that global segment.
Jack, did we go over enough? We got long, as long as we need.
We want you to go over just a little bit more, please.
Perfect. So we need some more questions.
And I'll put another issue on the table. I mean, obviously you can tell from the panel here, right? The other opportunity is we just got to drive much more diversity in the founder profile. And I think we're making some headway. And we need to also think about like what there may be some drivers that disproportionately impact founder pools. I mean, I'm particularly excited about sustainability because if you look at the numbers across that sector, much more diverse profile. We're seeing some pockets of that on the fintech side, but and there's some other big, and I mean, Cincinnati, I think, has really developed. I think it's always been there, but I think it's really starting to get much more organized around, commitment to D&I. There's like huge funds that are being created at the small business level, and I think we need to figure out how to turn that into a real competitive advantage at a time when Procter is seeking new audiences, Kroger is setting targets for diverse workplace. But I think that's like an area where I would volunteer. We have a long way to go, but a ton of opportunity if we get organized and approach it with a sense of urgency.
How is the state doing keeping the students who graduate from the universities here? And
I don't know the stats. I don't. John, you may have more of a perspective on it. I don't think it's a. I think it's a good but not great. I don't think it's a big crisis. I mean,
All I would say in terms of my observations on the labor market, the past 2 years or 18 months, whatever it is, it's different than it was before. I've onboarded a good number of startups that have pulled up stakes from New York, San Francisco, LA. Here, we've seen kind of the FANG employees given the freedom of location. If they have roots or they have family that has roots, they just sort of wound up at Cincinnati. So Blanked was like literally 15 times as many Google employees here. Not because Google wanted them here, but because they were sort of set free. They landed.
I don't think it's again, going back to my earlier comment about the journey, I don't think it's a bad thing at all that our talent works wherever after they graduate. I think the key is that they know that when they're ready to come back, that there is in fact an ecosystem here, and that's and most don't. I mean, we did a program called Entrepreneurs Change the World, and it's kind of focused on high schoolers and college kids, and it was really a trial tool. It's sort of like, okay, we know you're not going to be about raising money right now, but we almost want to give you an early exposure to this fantastic ecosystem. So you got to keep that in the back of your head. And if you end up going to Europe, or you go to the West Coast, at some point you're going to say, gosh, if I want to be the company, this is the best place to do it. And so, and I do think there's, you know, if a grad goes to Silicon Valley for a while, I think that could be a fantastic plus. All external focus is good for startups, right? You know, and you know, you don't stick around in one location for too long.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Cincinnati is the only city in Ohio that's grown, in the census, right? Grown by 3%. And that's because of the innovation in the city, not really. There's a whole lot of things happening. And whether it's new people moving into the state, into the city.
It's also why you corrected us on our real estate comment.
It's very, the growth in the city is extremely important for the growth and innovation in the city. So, while bringing on talent, I'm the first one hiring people remotely. We just hired our head of capital markets in Florida, who eventually will move to Cincinnati, but eventually is what it is. Right? And that's with hiring every person that we're hiring. It doesn't have to be Cincinnati. But the growing city will eventually get those people moving in. That's what's driving a lot of this this growth. Growth is driving innovation, and innovation is driving growth. It's a two-way street.
What else? Anything more singers for us?
It's a good time to grab some coffee for
Jack, is there any part of there? Was there a follow-up part of the program, or is it step away? Okay.
Project time.
How do you guys like the stadium?
Fabulous. Awesome.
I mean, that's a great example of something that I think just powers the innovation economy. We have a really tight relationship with FCC, and they love Union Hall, we love them. But you know, that's just bringing an international focus to. It's not that we weren't before, but it just, yeah, it's just a fantastic experience, and it further kind of globalizes, you know, the city, and I think that's super important. Stadium system. They just did it great. That's also just a great startup story. I think FCC is one of the best startup stories. It's just like popped out of nowhere, relatively, you know, it's you know, from conception to major league team. I mean, a lot of cities will be like, you know, the city, you know, for 10 years before they kind of make that bump, and it happened. And I think part of it was the fans were, you know, everybody was ready. That's almost like the startup metaphor for like embracing, you know, the small initiative and turning it into something really big, almost defying the odds. Jack, what's our guidance?
You want to be relieved of your duty?
Okay, thanks.
So you're finished, bullet one, and now I'm going to.
Come join our 361 firm community of investors and thought leaders. We have a lot of events created by the community as we collaborate on investments and philanthropic interests. Join us.